All right, I have a real treat for you today. I have the former speechwriter for Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and we're going to be talking about President Biden, the country, what's going on. Ken, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Stephen. Great to be here.
So this is Ken Khachigian, and you were the speechwriter primarily for Ronald Reagan, but you also had interaction with Richard Nixon.
I did, yes. I was in the President Nixon's White House for 5.5 years, and then followed him to San Clemente after his resignation, worked on his memoirs, helped with his memoirs, and then I oversaw the research for the David Frost interviews. It took 3 months off to head the research for his David Frost interviews. And then after we finished the memoirs, when he moved to New York, I became very close to him as a confidant throughout his post-presidency. And so until he passed away, I became very close to him all throughout the rest of his life. We became very close. So it was just a treat. He was a political legend, presidential giant, so just like Ronald Reagan. And it was amazing to sit at his side to learn all the things that I did at his feet. He was just a political genius and a master world leader, and all the things I learned from him were just amazing.
Interesting. Okay. Now you were the writer for uh, Nixon and also Ronald Reagan. How are Biden's speeches today compared to the speeches that you would have written for these two past presidents?
Well, for one thing, Biden, all he does is his speeches are rote. He just speaks rapid fire through the teleprompter. They don't have any of his own uh, passion or tone or content. It seems like it's just he's just reeling off a script that it seems like he's disengaged from. This is the feeling I'm getting more and more from his recent speeches. President Nixon hardly used a script unless it was a very formal speech or a televised speech from the Oval Office. He usually used what we called, President Nixon used what we called suggested remarks, that he took ideas and fact sheets that we gave him, and then he spoke without notes. And President Reagan, even when he spoke from a script, he edited heavily when he could, when he had a chance. He loved to write his own speeches. He loved to edit them and work on them. And he made notes on them. He carved them into paragraphs and sentences and broke them up. And because he was such a professional, it was amazing. So he put passion into them. But I watch Biden and I see him just go rapid fire through those speeches, and I'm just it's I don't know if disgraceful is the right word, but I'm just disappointed because he's just not showing the leadership that I would expect from a president of the United States.
Yeah, I've noticed. I went back and I've watched some of his speeches from when he was a senator and also a vice president, and he did a fairly good job of commanding the room.
Yeah,
He was articulate. He would pause and allow that emotion. If we leave Afghanistan now, and he would pause, it'll be your grandchildren that deal with. And
right,
now, like you say, it's like he's trying so hard to get through the speech that he's
right.
reading the quiet part. Pause for applause, end script, look to the left, things like that, where it's like, oh my gosh, this is like, even Ronald Reagan, who at the time was older in age compared to some presidents, he still had his wits about him and the ability to command a room. Biden, I saw, was giving out a presidential medal the other day, and it almost looked as if he didn't know where he was. It was very sad to watch.
I think Biden is almost fearful of making a mistake in giving a speech, so he goes through it so quickly so that he doesn't make an error in the speech. So he just does it rapid fire. It's gotten worse, I think, over the last year and a half, and it has to do with his cognitive impairment.
Yeah. I noticed in his first year he really struggled, and then the second year it was like I wondered if he was on that maybe $50,000 a year dementia medication, and then now they're saying, hey, maybe this guy needs to be drug tested, because when he's out interacting on a normal basis, he seems very lost, cognitively puzzled. But then at the State of the Union, it was like, whoa, wait a minute. Where'd you get all this energy and clarity? It's kind of confusing as an American citizen to watch.
Well, his State of the Union was a one-time put-on act, and even then, I think I don't think it was a very good speech. It was more of an act, and he had such a low bar going into it that coming out of it, he got a couple of points, 2 or 3 points boost in the polls, and everybody got excited about it. And now look where he is. He's back at 36% approval rating. And you know what it is? It's because it's the policies, and it's the inflation, it's the economy, it's all the policies that he's brought into his administration that is giving him the problems. So he can't overdo that with a speech. Ronald Reagan, sometimes when he had a problem, could overcome some of the problems with a great speech, but unfortunately, Joe Biden can't.
Yeah. Speaking of Ronald Reagan, I went back, I watched some of his speeches and just interactions with people. He was quite masterful at poking fun at Democrats and making jokes, but at the same time, I never got the feeling that he was trying to divide the nation. And yet, as I listened to Biden's speeches, they seem very, very cutting and very purposeful in, if you're not on my side, then you're not part of the country. You're an idiot. You almost don't have a place within our country. Do you get that same sense as you listen?
I think he's gotten very angry as he's gotten older, and I think that's a function of his cognitive impairment, frankly. I think he feels embattled, endangered in his presidency. I think he sees it slipping away. I think he feels he's probably going to lose the presidency. And as he becomes more embattled and cornered, he's gotten more angry and defensive. And that's where the anger comes through, and the division and the bitterness. And that's he doesn't realize that it hurts him. And I think if he did a pivot and became softer and a little more gentler and less divisive, it would frankly help him.
Yeah. He's gotten this persona, or this kind of nickname, for lack of a better word, on the internet, Dark Brandon. This dark, tough, mysterious Biden who comes across very angry and pessimistic, where most politicians, they try to come across as light and inspiring, pushing hope. I'm just not seeing that. Like, I'm thinking of his speech from last year, where they crop the TV in, and you see like the red lights, and I'm not comparing him to Hitler. I don't like when people do that, but it did have this like old world Germany feel to it, with the red lights and just him just angry. As you wrote speeches, or if you were consulting with somebody today, wouldn't writing hope and levity and optimism into a speech be a better strategy?
Oh, for sure. I always tried to find a way to not only hope was a basis for a speech with Reagan, but also found a way to put humor into it. And in fact, in the campaign of '84, I have to admit this, we hired a professional joke writer, because I couldn't do that myself. And although Reagan had his own storehouse of jokes, but we put a lot of humor and wit into all of his jokes. Like when we were at the Grand Ole Opry and making fun of Mondale's tax plan, and said it had more price tags than Minnie Pearl's hat, and or if we were joking, if he was joking about his age, we were in Milwaukee and he was at Old Heidelberg Park, and he said, you know, I can remember when they just called it Heidelberg Park. So it was, he'd laugh at himself and make fun of himself if it was an age issue. But we're always putting humor into his speeches and lighten up, and the crowd would laugh along with him. But then at the same time, a lot of those speeches were very serious back in '84 in the campaign, when he was talking about taxes and the differences between himself and Mondale. So he could be tough and cutting, but at the same time put humor in it. But at the end of the day, he'd end those speeches with a lot of hope and vision, and saying there was a better America and we're going to make a better America. And if you go back and listen to those speeches, you could hear that hope and vision come into every one of them.
Yeah, I don't feel that now. You know, he was coming off of the Jimmy Carter years where the inflation got out of control, like we're seeing now. And he was very honest. Hey, listen, we're going through a lot. We're doing everything that we can. We need you to be patient. And then the optimism. And now it's like, hey, you guys have enough money. Get over it. Inflation's not as bad. It's like lies and lies, and then make us feel guilty for being irritated that gas prices are high and grocery prices are high. It just seems like such a recipe for disaster to blame the victim and then also lie to them and leave them with no hope. It just doesn't make sense to me. But I've seen some of the people that Biden has surrounding him in the White House, and it does make me wonder who his speech writers are and his consultants.
You know, you raise a really, really good point, Stephen, that this speech he gave at Morehouse College just the other day was a perfect example of, I think, a speechwriter probably taking over Biden's brain. Maybe Biden had a big hand in that speech, but I have a sneaky feeling, I'd like to know who wrote that speech for Biden, because I have a feeling that was a speechwriter taking over Biden and putting words in his mouth. That was a very angry, ugly speech that was full of pessimism and anger, and had no hope for those Black graduates of Morehouse College, saying that they were victims and everything else. It was just, if you go back through and listen to that speech and read that speech, it was the most negative speech I've ever heard a president give in recent years. It was just terrible. And I bet you anything that was a speechwriter almost taking over the process and just putting it on the president's desk, and somebody convincing the president this is something you ought to give. And Biden at this point in his presidency just thinking, you know, I'm just tired. I'll just read this speech and give it no matter what.
Yeah. In my news show broadcast this morning, I talked about that. You know, I said, you know, love Trump or hate Trump, if you juxtapose the two speeches, his Bronx, New York speech, he says, can we set politics to the side for a second? Let me talk to you about hard work, finding your momentum, keeping it, knowing when to give up, knowing when to keep going, versus you're a victim of America. You're likely to be killed.
Right.
You love your country, but your country doesn't love you. It was like, wow, wait a minute. Like, why would you come out of college feeling like there's any hope that your country is going to be good, or that you're going to be able to raise a family or even make a living? It just felt it was the most like pessimistic, anti-American speech from a president that like you say, like that I've heard in a long time.
I think that Morehouse speech will go down in history as just one of the worst presidential speeches ever given. It really will. It will be a sample of everything what not to give in terms of a presidential speech.
Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, Ronald Reagan had a funny one-liner. He said, "In the present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems.
Right.
Government is the problem." Um, did he write that? Did you help him work on that? And also, do you think that that is still true today? That many of our problems are maybe the government getting in the way of things just naturally unfolding and working out?
Well, because President Reagan said that in his inaugural address, that line belongs to him. But that was a collaboration. One of the folks that I worked on that speech with him, and I sought help and collaboration with some of my colleagues, and we gave the president some ideas. But since he he delivered that line, that's his. But he believed it, and I believe it still, that government is not the solution; it's the problem. And he believed it then. He set out in that speech to create a crusade. And he believed it because he started thinking that from the days when he took over, when he began with in the 50s with the General Electric Theater, and then he started traveling the country throughout what he called the mashed potato circuit, and writing his own speeches for years and years and years, and seeing and interacting with real people throughout the country, and seeing the effect of government on them. And so those were his beliefs. Those were not anybody else's beliefs. These were his beliefs. Ronald Reagan never said anything that he didn't believe in. He didn't just read lines that we gave him and that he didn't believe in. It's unlike what I just told you that about Biden.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, tell me about your book, Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. Why did you write this, and what are we going to learn by reading it?
Well, I set out originally to write just about my years with President Reagan. I was his chief speechwriter, and I began traveling with him in the 1980 campaign as his chief speechwriter, and then helped him throughout his presidency. Then when I started writing, I realized that even though I got my PhD at the University of Reagan, I got my bachelor and master's degree at the College of Richard Nixon. So I had to write about my experiences with Richard Nixon. So my first chapter is that last week of Watergate, during the resignation, when I was part of the impeachment defense team. So the first few chapters are about that, and going to San Clemente and helping him in his recovery, and segueing into working as Richard Nixon helped introduce me to people, to introduce me to Reagan. So the book starts with Richard Nixon helping me get introduced to Reagan, and then working with Reagan in the campaign. The reason I brought Nixon into the book so much is that Nixon actually became an advisor to Reagan, not only in the 80 campaign, but in the 84 campaign, and then throughout his presidency.
Oh.
And that's what a lot of people don't know. And I was his sort of secret intermediary in the 80 campaign, the 84 campaign, and throughout the presidencies. But I wrote the book also to make sure that people knew about the crusade that Reagan brought to the presidency, and the economic recovery plan in 1980, and the tax cuts that he sought, the effort he had to cut government regulations and to get government under control, and how sometimes he had to fight his own staff. And I wanted to bring that into the picture too. He didn't always have people around him that wanted to fulfill his own policies. And so sometimes he struggled with his own staff. So I felt that I needed to write that in the book as well. But also I wanted to talk about a lot of the big speeches that we worked on during the presidency, the inaugural speech, and a couple of the State of the Unions we worked on. So it's a mixture of a lot of the things, a lot of the stories I had to tell. But And one of the big things I wanted to tell was the story of how a woman got onto the Supreme Court. That's a story in the 1980 campaign, and I hope the readers will get the background of that. And there's other vignettes that are important that haven't been told yet, and all these kinds of stories that are sort of hidden in the book that they'll have to buy and find out.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Well, I was actually very grateful to hear you speak so positively of Richard Nixon, because I think the general public, especially for someone younger like me, is that, oh, he was bad, he got in trouble, he got kicked out. But then as I've interviewed Roger Stone and Monica Crowley and now yourself, I get this image that Richard Nixon was this giant of a president, just like, and his understanding of politics and the workings of the country was just on a level of brilliance that we don't see. And yet, we don't hear that. You hear about the love of Ronald Reagan regularly,
Right.
but everybody that I've spoken with, 3 or 4 other people, just they say just how wonderful Nixon was. And I didn't know that he was consulting with Ronald Reagan on his campaigns. That's good information.
Well, it's really interesting. We had to keep it a secret because we were only 6 years past the president's resignation, and Watergate was still sort of a hot potato. And so all the communications I had with the former President Nixon during the 80 campaign had to be kept a secret. And he sent me secret memos during that campaign that I passed on to then Governor Reagan as he was campaigning. But one of the very interesting things during that campaign was that Nixon was so brilliant with his strategy. He said, "You've got to emphasize the economy, the economy, the economy," all through there. Everybody thinks that James Carville's a genius because he came up with the idea that the economy is stupid. Well, Richard Nixon thought of that 12 years before Carville ever thought of it. But Nixon was just an absolute genius in terms of how he strategized. Now, I'm not saying he controlled the campaign. That's not true.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that he gave some great ideas, but he also gave Reagan a lot of encouragement when Reagan was down, especially in '84 after that first debate with Mondale when he didn't do so well. He sent in a lot of encouragement in his memos and signals and in phone calls to me that I passed on to Reagan.
Interesting. Oh, that's see, I love hearing these backstories. Roger Stone told me a story about how one night he and Nixon were speaking late into the night. They had both had a couple of drinks, and Nixon started opening up about Lyndon Johnson and the JFK assassination. He said it was one of the most fascinating conversations he ever had. Final question for you, Ken. As a speechwriter, you spent a lot of time at Reagan's side at the White House on maybe Air Force One.
Yeah.
How hard was it to get into his mind when you were writing a speech? Okay, going back to the Morehouse speech with Biden, it seems like such a disconnect that it's like somebody doesn't really know Biden's mind. So how did you get into the mind of Nixon and Reagan in order to give them a speech that they would say, yes, this is exactly what I want to say to the American people?
Especially with President Reagan, it was a matter of just listening to him, paying attention to him, listening to his other speeches. And when you sat with him, and especially in the Oval Office in 1981, when we came into the administration and he started it, he'd put aside his papers and say, "Now listen, I want to tell you about my economic views." All you had to do was pay attention and take notes and listen to him give these long disquisitions on his views on the economy. So instead of trying to impose my views on him, I would pay attention to what he said. And then he would say him in long, eloquent sentences on his views. And it was easy. All I had to do was pay attention to him and then come back to him with all the views that he fed back to me. And then I would listen to his speeches and his cadence on his words and how he spoke. And speechwriters, all they need to do if they're working with somebody as great a communicator as Ronald Reagan is not to try to put their own words and own sense into them, but to listen to them. I have to say this, Nancy Reagan was one of the people who gave me the greatest advice. She says, on a long car ride in Illinois during the 80 campaign, she says, you know, with Ronnie, it's important to be emotional. The main thing for Ronnie is you have to be emotional. And so I paid attention to her. I paid attention to him. I didn't try to be me. I tried to be him. So it wasn't all that difficult. You just try not to impose yourself on the president.
Gotcha. Interesting. Very, very insightful. This has been a fun conversation. I'm going to put a direct link down below to Behind Closed Doors so that people can go check it out. Ken, thank you so much for coming on.
Good.
Thank you for your service to our country. I appreciate it. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Enjoy. Let's do it again.
Thank you.